Hey guys, how's it going? Really sorry it's taken me so long to tape this last little part of the developmental chapter that I never got to, especially because I know some of this is relevant to some of the thoughts you might be having for your peer scholar assignment. So without further ado, I just want to get into it. Welcome to my office at home. Hopefully this is the last time you see it. It's only because I've put myself in this bind. Alright, so I'm going to jump right in here at slide 5. Hopefully you've already read about some of this, but nonetheless, let me try to do it as I meant to do it in class. So, I'm going to talk about two things here that are related. The psychological approach to trying to get at the parent-child relationship, or something that in psychology we call attachment or attachment style. And we'll talk about styles of parenting in a couple of slides. So, first with attachment. The idea of this paradigm, so it's a paradigm that Mary Ainsworth created, and she's trying to come up with a way of, a window really, into the sort of relationship that a child has with its primary caregiver. And the two sort of core bits of this relationship are trying to get at how anxious a child is around strangers. So how they behave in the presence of strangers. Are they doing things like crying and clinging, or do they seem more open and willing to interact with people other than the primary caregiver? And then separation anxiety. How does the child react when they're separated from their primary caregiver? And so the procedure kind of mixes these two things. And we looked at it a little bit in class. I think literally if you click on this picture of Mary. Let's try it just to make sure it fires up. It should open YouTube.
Can the essential elements of home life be translated?
And we kind of did this already in class, where we saw the child, just to remind you, we saw the child playing at first with the mother, and then the mother leaving, and then eventually them playing with sort of interacting with a stranger. But then the critical event was, of course, when the mother left, how did the child react? And especially during the reunion, when the mother returns, how does the child react? And that's a critical point because we see different ways in which they react that tell us a little bit about the relationship. What we really like to see is what we call evidence of a secure attachment. And notice here it says secure autonomous. It means the child feels comfortable sort of being themselves because they know the mother's there and because they have a good relationship with the mother. So when a child has that kind of relationship, we see a couple of things. First of all, we see them more willing to interact with the stranger. So as far as stranger anxiety goes, they seem less. They seem more explorative, more adventurous, as it were. Although even when they are adventuring, they often do look back at the mother, make connection with the mother. And so it really looks as though the mother, or the primary caregiver, I should say, is almost like a safety net of a sort. And as long as that mother's there, then they feel quite comfortable exploring a little bit. If the mother leaves, the child does usually get a lot more anxious. So just about every child, usually, although we'll talk about some, feels uncomfortable when the mother leaves, but especially the ones that have the secure attachment. So the notion is they feel really bonded to their mother. And so when the mother leaves, that's an anxious situation for it. They're on their own. But then what you normally see is when the mother returns, the child goes to the mother almost, immediately, and any signs of upsetness that it might have been displaying tend to disappear. And what you really see is a sort of relief and oh, thank goodness that you're back kind of reaction. And so that's the kind of thing we like to see. Now, you don't always see that. Sometimes you see a very different kind of reaction. So let me jump all the way to anxious avoidant. In the anxious avoidant, this is clickable. I'm just curious what I go to here. I think this is all about, you can be an organ donor. I think this is all about the disorganized. So let me do it.
The impact on them is dramatic.
Yeah, okay. So we're going to come back to that. I know what I'm doing there. But let's be here first. An anxious avoidant child. The notion there is that, well, really in both of these, let's kind of talk about these two together, and then this is going to be something else entirely. But let's talk about these two together because they're related, and I think sometimes it helps to bring in these adult terms as well. So in the secure autonomous or the secure attachment, the adult is usually quite attentive, and you know, literally is showing their child in a very clear way that they love them, that they're there for them. So let's talk about some other ways a primary caregiver can interact with their child. So one is preoccupied. We often see this with very young mothers, literally mothers who are not yet finished being children sometimes themselves. They're still embroiled in a social world. So imagine a 17-year-old, 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 20-year-old mother, but they're still young women themselves, and they may be less willing than an older woman might be to essentially give up their life for this child, to essentially put all that on hold and focus on the child. So instead they maybe keep their life going. And so now, yes, they're mothering, but they're mothering in, the word here is a preoccupied way or a distracted way. So they're just not, in the child's eyes, the mother is not constantly there mentally for them. But they are sometimes, and they are generally a good mother. They're just a little distant, a little cold, a little preoccupied sometimes. So in that case, we sometimes see what we call anxious resistant. And for example, in the Ainsworth task, here when the mother returns, the child will often note the mother's return, sometimes seem a little better because the mother's returned, but they won't show that same going to them and hugging them and getting comforted and like, okay, everything's better now, I feel all right. Okay, they keep a little bit of coldness, a little bit of distance from the mother. Let's take this a step further now. Now imagine a mother that's, I keep picking on mothers, but it should be primary caregiver. So imagine a primary caregiver that is worse than preoccupied. Okay, they're not just preoccupied, they actually maybe wish they weren't a mother. You know, maybe are bothered by the situation they find themselves in. And so they actually react in a semi-negative way. Now we're going to have to make a strong distinction here between dismissive and fearful. So that it's not as though they're doing anything scary to the child. But they are giving the child the impression that, man, life would be better if you weren't here. Okay? And so in this case, obviously, the child can read those signals and has the sense that maybe they're not loved or wanted. And in that case, the relationship shows these sort of anxious avoidant kind of signs where the child, A, doesn't really know how to react around the mother, and B, may often choose to keep a distance from the mother. So they don't show that warm connection at all. And so the sort of, if you think of the preoccupied as sort of between these two, so this child may not even notice when the mother comes back, or may not even seem to notice, may not even seem to care that the mother's back, or may actually actively avoid interactions with the mother should the mother try to initiate any sort of contact. Okay, so we're kind of going on a step here, and then the worst step, or the most crazy one, I guess, is a situation where the mother, in this case, probably is what we would call an unfit mother, and actually tries to, doesn't try to, but behaves in a way around the child that scares the child. And sometimes this has to do with mixed signals too. It may be that the mother is nice sometimes. So imagine an alcoholic mother or something like that, where the mother is nice sometimes, but really nasty at other times. The important thing here is, in these sorts of relationships, the child really doesn't know what to think of its mother. Doesn't know whether it loves the mother or is scared of the mother or whatever. And so this can really mess a child up when the mother or the primary caregiver is on occasion or often sort of nasty to the point where the child can be fearful, can be scared. And this can lead to what we call a disorganized personality type. So I think that brings us to that video. So let's do that. I actually had it here, so let's just listen to this for a bit.
Yeah.
What tends to happen for those children is that they tend to have peer difficulties.
This is anxious avoidant, sorry, that she's talking about right now.
With peers in school, but they tend to actually be quite competent with adults. Interestingly, they're often quite competent away from their caregivers. So in a preschool environment can do quite well interacting with the preschool teacher, for example. Tend to withdraw when upset. But one of the key things that you learn, that a child learns during their moment-to-moment interactions with caregivers when they're young, is they learn how to regulate themselves in terms of their emotion, their behavior, and their attention. And children with this pattern that we're describing tend to learn to withdraw when upset and don't seek out a caregiver for support.
Okay, so I want to stop there. That's just that distinction between anxious avoidant. So, keep in your mind, the idea here is for anxious avoidant, they can't really count on their mother to be there. And so what she's suggesting, and a critical point from the Ainsworth studies, is that these relationships that begin with the primary caregiver can have follow-through effects that affect the way they interact with other people later in life. And that's what she's kind of describing there, is that notion that they can do okay with certain other people, but they're obviously a little messed up, especially around their primary caregiver. But now we're going to the more extreme case of the disorganized. So now this is a child that actually felt, more than just neglected, but actually was probably fearful of their parent.
The children we worry about the most are children who don't have any coherent strategy for coping with distress. And those typically are children who've experienced major disruptions in their attachment relationships. And if the attachment relationship were to be formally assessed, they're generally categorized as disorganized, as having disorganized attachment. And what has generally happened for those children is they have come to fear their caregiver for a variety of reasons. The caregiver may have engaged in behavior that was frightening for the child, or the caregiver may have appeared frightened of the child, which is also frightening for the child. And the challenges that the child has learned to fear the caregiver. So when they're upset, rather than being able to go to that caregiver for support, they don't have a strategy. So they're essentially experiencing what's often called an irresolvable paradox, where the caregiver, who should be your source of support, is also the source of fear.
Not just the source of support, but also the modeling of how to deal with things. And so if the caregiver is not very good at dealing with anxiety themselves, then the child loses that source of understanding of how to do that. Okay, so I was going to say let's leave this, but I think I just have this as a way to kind of think about this all. So this is a bit of a flow chart, talking about how attachment can develop. So, if the attachment figure sufficiently near, attentive, and responsive? This is one of the things the child is kind of checking with. Is that primary caregiver there both spatially, physically, but also cognitively? And if they are, then this gives the child a lot of security. And can, kind of allow the child, again, say playful, less inhibited, smiling, explorative oriented, sociable, when they feel they have that attachment. But if they don't, then we ask questions like, okay, so it says here, a hierarchy of attachment behaviors develop due to increasing fear and anxiety. So when they're not sure if the parent is there, then they do this visual checking and signaling to reestablish contact and calling and pleading and moving to reestablish contact. So they really want that. If this happens consistently, then the child becomes preoccupied with the attachment figure, clinging, anxious about separation and exploration. Okay, so they become very anxious. If there's just that sort of, sometimes the parent's there, sometimes they're not. But if consistently the parent is not there, then the child becomes defensively avoidant of contact and appears indifferent about separation and reunion. So, just to tie all this together, so this isn't really the disorganized, but it brings those first three categories. This is what leads to secure, but if the parent is not always plugged in, then it's a question of, well, are they sometimes plugged in, and how consistent is the not paying attention? And if it's very consistent, then we get to this avoidant behavior. If it's sometimes they're there and sometimes they're not, then you get more of the anxious behavior where it seems like the child is trying to build that relationship back. Okay, so for me, this sometimes helps me kind of think about all those things together. All right, so now I want to leave attachment. There's a lot about that in the book, and I want to talk about this parenting style very quickly. And I know some of this was covered in the book too, so I don't think I need to do it in detail, but there's neat stuff when we all look back at our parents and then think about ourselves as being parents, which is what I'm asking some of you to do anyway for the Peer Scholar thing. And so here's the grid. Let's talk this through. So parents, people often put these parents on this 2x2 grid. One is, how responsive are they to the child when the child I don't know. When the child is doing something, are they responding? Are they reacting? So they're either high or they're low in responsiveness. And then how demanding are they? How demanding of a parent are they? Are they very demanding? They have very high expectations, or are they kind of low demanding? Okay. Now we can start just here, and this is a very easy way to start thinking about it. If you have a parent that's not very low demanding, so they're not really expecting a lot of you to some extent, and they don't respond much to anything you do, we call this a neglectful parent. And this is the type that you might, if we go back, where you might expect to see more of this of anxious avoidant kind of behavior coming out. Parents just not paying attention. So we're not to the disorganized. They're not being nasty. Oh shoot, sorry about that. But they're being, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Welcome to my world. What is going on now? Whatever it is, stop. Thank you. All right. There we are. Back to neglectful. Now, there's something else here. Let's go to permissive here. Permissive is the parent that we all thought we wanted to have when we were young, but a lot of research suggests it's not such a good thing. That a permissive parent is the one that essentially lets the child do whatever they want. In fact, in extreme cases, they may try to be friends with their child and their child's friends. They might want to be part of that whole gang. And so they're basically allowing the child to do whatever the child wants, and they're feeling maybe like this is a way of being very loving. Okay, so lays them out differently. But let's look at these now and talk about the kinds of personality traits we tend to see in children with these two kinds of parents, first of all. So if they have that negligent parent, then often the children grow up to feel this wounded, vulnerable, angry, unrestrained. So it's leaving them feeling unloved, really. And that leaves them feeling victimized, leaves them feeling vulnerable. Low self-esteem, that sort of thing. The permissive parent that we think we all want, children that go through that kind of parenting tend to have a very self-centered, disobedient, immature, rebellious, disrespectful style. They think the world revolves around them because their parent essentially suggested that to them, in the way they were raised. And so often children of permissive parents are not very friendly. They have a lot of trouble making friends, and they don't tend to be very happy children. So, as nice as this might sound at one level, it doesn't seem like your parents are doing you a favor at all when they take a permissive approach. All right, so now let's go over to the demandingness. Now we have two, authoritative and authoritarian. Authoritative, think of it as a dictator, okay? Authoritative is somebody that lays down the rules. You must follow the rules. If you don't follow the rules, you're going to be in trouble. I don't have to explain the rules. You live under my roof. You do what I say, and that's it. Okay? Some of you may say, whoa, that feels like my parents. That sort of parent tends to produce children that are ultimately anxious, insecure, perfectionists. They're always trying to do everything right, and they're resentful. They feel a little bit of anger and resentment for having to toe the line in this way. Wow, this isn't sounding good. There must be some positive news here, and the positive news is in the authoritarian. This is the style of parenting that seems to produce the best results. It's sort of like authoritative, but different in critical ways. So, Caesar, who talks about the appropriate way to train dogs and raise dogs, says you need rules, boundaries, and limitations. And that's sort of what an authoritarian parent has. They do certainly have rules, but the rules have reasons, have a logic behind it. And so they ask the children to behave in certain ways. They expect them to behave in certain ways. They may punish them if they don't, but not in that authoritative way. It's not like just from on high. It's often in a much more intellectual way. So, you know, we have this rules. You have to be home at 11. You know why that is. We have to go to bed at 11. We have jobs the next day. We have to know that you're home and safe so that we can sleep well, blah, blah, blah. But there's a rationale behind it. And so they expect you to follow these rules, which have a logical basis. And they're also willing to bend the rules. If you have a good reason why a given rule should not be applied in a certain situation, and you can explain it, an authoritarian parent will say, okay, this one time we will change the rule to be X or Y for the following reasons, but we're going back to it, whatever. Okay, so that's the authoritarian. These children of authoritarian parents, sorry, I got these mixed up. Authoritarian is the nasty one. I'm sorry. Authoritative is the nice one, because responsiveness, I got flipped on responsiveness. So authoritarian, just so you understand this, they don't care what the child thinks. So they're not going to respond to your pleas, whereas an authoritative parent will. They'll listen to you, they'll consider your point of view, and they'll bend the rules. So authoritative parents, which are the right ones, why does that keep doing that to me? This leads to children who are secure, responsive, well-adjusted, respectful. Okay, so the right way. The good kids come from authoritative parents. So think about all that. Think about when you're a parent, what you're going to do. Think about your own parents. But that's what psychology says is the best approach to parenting. And I'm going to leave it there. Alrighty, thanks.